They say every silence has a sound, and that, in the most isolated places on Earth, it's possible to hear that which cannot be explained. In the far north, where the mountains seem to touch the sky and the wind blows forgotten stories, there is a canyon that maps a void and ancients only whisper about. There, between abysses and echoes that seem to have a voice of their own, someone disappeared, and someone remained. A lone explorer, drawn by legends and remains, ventured beyond the limits of logic. But what he found in that abyss was not just the end of the trail. It was the beginning of something that would defy his understanding, because in that deep darkness, there were eyes watching. And when all seemed lost, he discovered, sometimes the last wolf doesn't leave. He waits. Before you continue, stop and think. Would you have the courage to follow a path from which no one returns? To face a silence so profound that it seems to think for itself? If you want to understand what happens when man goes beyond the limits of what is known, follow this story to the end. This story will shake everything you believe to be real. There was a legend whispered among the older hunters, something no one dared repeat aloud in broad daylight. It spoke of a gorge where not even ravens flew, and where the echo returned not only the sound, but the intention. A place where those who entered did not return. They called it Abyss of Silence. For most, it was just another story created by the cold and solitude of the north. But for Elias, it was a riddle that needed to be solved. A naturalist, a scholar of forgotten trails and endangered animal behaviors, he didn't view the legend with fear. He saw it as a calling. Guided only by old maps and broken accounts, he set out in late autumn, when the winds still allowed trails, and the snow had not yet completely covered the paths. For days, he found nothing but silent trees and the creak of his own breath. But on the seventh day, something changed. At the edge of the forest, where the trees no longer grew, he found tracks, not human footprints, nor moose or bear. They were large, spaced, and solitary. Wolf tracks, but only one. It was strange. Wolves rarely roam alone for so long, especially in such remote areas. Elias followed the tracks, not on impulse, but instinct. Something about the shapes left in the frozen earth seemed recent, as if the creature had been waiting for him. The path led him to a cleft between the mountains, a narrow gap between towering rocks. The air there seemed heavier. The sound of his own footsteps returned distorted, as if the space around him had a will of its own. Elias stopped. The cold had changed. It was no longer physical. It was a chill that started on the skin but went deep into the soul. Still, he followed, because he knew something there was too important to ignore. As they crossed the crevice, the light dissipated. The trail disappeared into rocks and shadows. And in the very center of that chasm, a figure appeared. Standing on an ice-covered rock was the wolf, lonely, large, with eyes as ancient as the mountains. It didn't growl, it didn't run, it just stared, as if it recognized Elias. And in that instant, between the silence and the wind that didn't touch the trees, Elias understood it was not he who had found the abyss. It was the abyss that had waited for him. In most stories, the wolf appears, and then disappears. An omen, a whisper of instinct, a warning from nature that you've trespassed on the wrong territory. But that wolf, he didn't go away. Elias stood still for a long moment. The wind among the rocks had stopped. The rustling of branches in the distance had ceased. It was as if time itself were watching. The wolf, its head slightly tilted, stared at Elias as if waiting for a choice, a step, a gesture. But there was no threat in its gaze. There was attention. When Elias took a step forward, the animal took 2 steps back. When he stopped, the wolf lay down on the rock, still staring. It was as if the territory belonged to both of them, and neither of them quite knew why. And then, as if obeying an ancient command, the wolf rose, walked around the stones, and entered a narrow path Elijah had not noticed before. And for some reason, without thinking, without planning, Elijah followed. The trail was uneven, made of broken ice and twisted branches. The cold intensified, but now there was another sensation accompanying each step, that he was no longer on a mission of study or exploration. He was being led. Ahead, the wolf walked slowly. He never looked back, but Elijah felt as if he knew the wolf was following. The path led them to a hidden clearing, a hollow of silence between the mountains. There, the sun barely touched the ground, but in the center stood a tree, old, twisted, alive even in the ice, and around the tree, bones, fences made of branches, small stone totems, and teeth, markings on the rocks, signs of human presence or something close to it. And there, lying by the tree, the wolf waited. Elias approached cautiously. The animal didn't move. It just watched him with eyes that seemed more wise than savage. There was a strange serenity there, as if he had passed through a veil, as if this place were outside the world and the wolf was its guardian. And then, for the first time, Elijah spoke. "Are you real?" No answer, no sound. But something has changed. The wolf stood up, looked at the sky, howled, and from within the forest, other eyes emerged. It wasn't just him. The silent pack had arrived, but none of them growled, none advanced. They just watched, as if they had been summoned, as if they were waiting for something or someone. And in that instant, Elijah understood that the path he had followed, it didn't end there. It was just the beginning. Time seemed to have no effect on that place. There was no wind, no sound of crows, no rustling of trees, only the rhythm of their breathing and the almost mystical sound of the snow slowly melting beneath the pack's bodies. Elijah was surrounded by wolves, but no fear dwelt there. They didn't advance, didn't test, didn't threaten. They stood around like sentinels, like memories given form. And the first, the one who had guided him here, remained close, as if it were the link between the two worlds. Elias knelt, not in submission, but in respect. The ground was covered in footprints, and not just wolf footprints. There were human marks, too. Boot scuffs, broken bones, inscriptions on the stones. He ran his fingers over one of these symbols, a circle with a line through it. It was a sign he'd seen before, scribbled in the journals of missing explorers. A symbol left for those who came after, as a warning or an invitation. There, in that lost space between the trees and the myth, Elias began to understand. Those wolves weren't just alive. They carried stories. They were heirs to an invisible line, an ancient force. That connected man and beast. Perhaps it was the spirit of the place, perhaps something beyond. The wolves, one by one, were gone. They vanished into the snow like shadows dissolved in the gray light of the dying day. Except one. The same wolf. He approached. He stopped in front of Elias, and for a moment their eyes met as if they shared the same memory, the same time, the same purpose. And then, slowly, he nuzzled the man's shoulder. A touch. Simple, but deep enough to pierce the flesh. Elias felt something break inside. It wasn't pain. It was as if the ice inside him, the thing that had always kept him distant, rational, analytical, was breaking. He cried, not out of fear, nor out of relief, but because I had found what I wasn't looking for, a link with the inexplicable. The wolf took one last look and left. Elias stood there for long minutes until the cold bit his bones again. But now, even alone, he didn't feel alone. The trail of footprints was still there, and he would follow it back. Not in a hurry. Not with answers. Just with the weight of something you can't forget, because some footprints don't disappear. They stay. Inside, the snow fell again. Fine, silent, like a veil over an ancient secret. Elias walked slowly, feeling every muscle crave rest, but he didn't stop. Something pulled him forward, like an invisible thread connected to the wolf that had disappeared into the shadows of the forest. There was an unspoken promise, an echo that still vibrated within him. The path narrowed. Crooked trees, gnarled roots, and broken rocks created a trail that felt less like a place and more like a trial. The air was colder, but not icy. It was thick, almost as if the environment itself wanted to test their mettle, and then he reached what seemed to be the end of the trail. A stone wall, high, ancient, cracked by 1,000 winters. In the center, a crack. Not a clear entrance, but a narrow crack, as if someone or something had forced it open long ago. That was where the footprints ended. Elijah hesitated. The silence was total. Not the sound of falling snow, not the sound of wind. Only his heart. He passed through the crack. Inside there was not complete darkness, but a bluish light, filtered through ice crystals embedded in the cave walls. And in the center was him, the wolf, alone, sitting like a monk on vigil. But now, something was different. The animal's fur was grayer, its gaze deeper, as if time had passed differently in their creature, as if this were more than a wolf. Elijah took a step. The ground shook, not because of an earthquake, but because something inside him was breaking. Forgotten memories surfaced, his father lost on ancient trails, stories whispered in childhood about guardians of the forest, about creatures that appeared to those who needed them and knew how to listen. The wolf stood up, walked toward him, stopped a few inches away. They looked at each other again, and for the first time, Elijah didn't just see an animal, saw pain, saw time, saw loss, but you also saw choice. That wolf wasn't there by chance. He was keeping something, an abyss, not physical, but symbolic, the line between the man who survives and the one who awakens. And then, the wolf turned into the cave, stopping at the edge of a deep, narrow well. Elijah understood. The guardian didn't want to protect him from something. I wanted to show what was on the other side of nature, that which was neither wild nor rational. Just true. But what he saw in there, only he would know. Because at that moment, the camera fell to the floor. The image is lost. The sound disappears. Only the echo remains of a breath, or maybe a howl.